It is late Sunday afternoon, and two men are walking away from Jerusalem. They are walking away from the center of the story. For 3 years, they had believed they were following the Messiah. But Friday ended in blood, trauma, and a Roman cross. Now, it is the first day of the week, and despite the frantic, confusing rumors of an empty tomb and visions of angels, these two disciples have packed their things. They are heading to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles away. The text tells us their faces are downcast. They are trying to make sense of the sudden collapse of their world. And as they walk, a stranger joins them on the dusty road. We know it is Jesus. But Luke chapter 24 tells us something strange. It says that their eyes were kept from recognizing him. This is not a trick of the light. This is not just the glare of the setting sun or the exhaustion of the journey. Something is actively keeping them from seeing the reality of who is walking right beside them. The stranger asks what they are discussing, and they pour out their grief. They tell him about Jesus of Nazareth, a prophet powerful in word and deed. They tell him about the betrayal and the crucifixion, and they say the most heartbreaking words in the chapter. We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Past tense. We had hoped. What follows is arguably the greatest Bible study in human history, starting with Moses and all the prophets. The stranger begins to explain to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. For 7 miles, Jesus walks them through the biblical scroll. He shows them that the Messiah had to suffer these things and then enter his glory. He preaches the perfect sermon. He connects every dot. He traces every shadow. Later, they will admit that their hearts were burning within them while he spoke, but their eyes remained closed. And this is the central tension of the story. This is the detail we often read right past. Think about what is happening here. Hours of walking, hours of listening to that familiar voice unfold the ancient promises. Perfect theology, perfect biblical teaching. Yet, the teaching does not open their eyes. Knowledge alone, even perfect scriptural knowledge, is not enough to make them recognize the risen Christ. Jesus does not reveal his identity at the climax of the sermon. He waits. As they approach the village of Emmaus, Jesus acts as if he is going farther. But they urge him strongly to stay, because the day is almost over. So he goes in to stay with them. They sit down at the table. He is the guest, but suddenly, he assumes the role of the host. He takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it to them. And in that exact moment, the text says, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. Then, he vanishes from their sight. Why? Why did a simple meal do what hours of perfect teaching could not? What was it about that ordinary bread that finally shattered their blindness? Most people assume it was just a nice moment of fellowship. Or perhaps they think the disciples suddenly saw the scars on his hands when he reached for the loaf. But the biblical text is doing something much deeper here. It was not just that Jesus broke bread, it was the specific, 4-part way he did it. He took, he blessed, he broke, and he gave. This was not a random sequence of actions. It was a deliberate, theological pattern. And these disciples had seen him do it before. To understand why the disciples' eyes were suddenly opened in Emmaus, we have to rewind the tape. We need to look at what happened before the cross. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus performs a specific sequence of actions with bread. It happens at major turning points in his ministry. And the writer is very careful to record the exact verbs used. Go back to Luke chapter 9. Jesus is in a desolate place. A crowd of 5,000 men, plus women and children, has followed him. The day is ending. The disciples want to send the crowds away to find food. Instead, Jesus tells them to bring what they have. 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish. What happens next is one of the most famous miracles in the Bible, but most readers focus entirely on the multiplication. They focus on the sheer volume of food and the 12 baskets left over. But look at the grammar of the miracle. Look at the exact sequence of actions. Luke chapter 9, verse 16 says, "Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke them. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. He took, he blessed, he broke, he gave." This is not just a description of serving a meal. It is a highly formalized, deliberate sequence. And the disciples were right there. They were the ones receiving the broken bread from his hands. They saw the posture. They heard the blessing. They watched the breaking. This four-part action was becoming his signature. Now, fast forward to the night before the crucifixion. Luke chapter 22. Jesus is gathered with his closest friends in the upper room. It is the Passover meal. The atmosphere is heavy. He tells them he has eagerly desired to eat this Passover with them before he suffers. Then, he reaches for the bread. And the exact same pattern appears again. Luke chapter 22, verse 19 says, "And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them." Took, blessed, broke, gave. It is the identical sequence. But this time, he adds something new. He attaches a profound, shocking meaning to the action. He says, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The broken bread is no longer just miraculous provision, like it was for the 5,000. It is now a picture of himself. It is a physical symbol of the life he is about to lay down. The two disciples walking to Emmaus were part of the wider circle of Jesus' followers. Even if they were not seated at the main table in the upper room, they knew his ways. They knew the stories. So, when they sit down at the table in Emmaus 3 days later, they are not just watching a stranger tear off a piece of crust. They are watching a specific, loaded, theological sequence unfold in real time. The stranger takes the loaf. He looks up and blesses it. He breaks it. He gives it. The moment the bread is broken, the signature is complete. The action triggers the revelation. The pattern points perfectly to the person. But this raises a deeper question. Why bread? Why did Jesus choose a meal as the ultimate way to reveal himself? Why not a pillar of fire, or a loud voice from the heavens, or a grand display of power? Why did he bind his deepest revelation to the simple act of taking, blessing, breaking, and giving? To answer that, we have to look past the upper room. We have to look past the feeding of the 5,000. We have to go all the way back to the very beginning of the biblical scroll. Because long before Jesus broke bread in Emmaus, there was another meal. The very first meal. And that meal also opened human eyes, but in a very different way. Let us go back to the very first pages of the Bible. Genesis chapter 3. We are in the Garden of Eden. The environment is one of perfect fellowship. Humanity is walking with God in the cool of the day. There is no shame. There is no fear. There is no hiding. God gives Adam and Eve incredible freedom. They can eat from any tree in the garden, except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You know the story. The serpent approaches. He plants a seed of doubt about the goodness of God. He suggests that God is holding out on them. He convinces them that if they eat from the forbidden tree, their eyes will be opened and they will be like God. But pay close attention to the sequence of actions when the temptation reaches its peak. Genesis chapter 3, verse 6 says, "She took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate." She took, she gave. They reach out and take what was not offered. They try to secure their own wisdom, their own life, on their own terms. And then comes verse 7, a phrase that changes the course of human history. Then the eyes of both were opened. This is the first time in Scripture that human eyes are opened in this way. But the serpent's promise was a twisted half-truth. Their eyes are opened, but what do they actually see? They do not see the glory of God. They do not see the beauty of the world. They see their own nakedness. They experience shame for the very first time. They realize they are vulnerable, exposed, and broken. And what is their immediate response? They sew fig leaves together, and they hide. They hide from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. This is the great fracture. Most people think of the fall as just breaking a divine rule. But look at the shape of the narrative. The fall is a meal. The biblical story of human exile begins with humanity taking food that was not meant to be taken, eating it, and having their eyes open to shame and separation. It is a meal of rebellion, a meal of grasping, a meal that fundamentally breaks our communion with the Creator. Now, lay this ancient text next to the story of Emmaus. In Genesis chapter 3, humanity takes and gives. Their eyes are opened, and the result is shame, fear, and distance from God. In Luke chapter 24, Jesus takes and gives. Their eyes are opened, and the result is grace, recognition, and perfect communion with God. This is not an accident. The biblical writers are drawing a massive, sweeping arc from the first pages of the Torah to the final chapter of Luke. Because humanity fell at a meal, The fracture in human nature had to be healed at a meal. In Eden, Adam and Eve acted as their own hosts, grasping for equality with God and taking the food of their own choosing. In Emmaus, the risen Christ assumes the role of the host, offering himself to humanity. In Eden, the opening of their eyes caused them to run away from God into the darkness. In Emmaus, the opening of their eyes will cause them to run through the darkness, back to Jerusalem, carrying the news that God is alive. The table at Emmaus is the exact, deliberate reversal of the tree in Eden. But to get from the Garden of Genesis to the village of Emmaus took thousands of years. The fracture in the human heart was deep. By reaching for the fruit, humanity had forgotten how to trust the provision of God. We had forgotten how to simply receive. So, God had to begin a slow, careful process of retraining his people. Before they could recognize the true bread of heaven, he had to teach them how to eat again. And to do that, he took a wandering nation into the middle of a barren desert. After humanity fractured its relationship with God at a meal, the human heart became wired to grasp, to hoard, and to secure its own survival. We forgot how to receive. We forgot how to trust that God is a good host. So, when God rescued the nation of Israel from slavery in Egypt, he led them into the wilderness, and almost immediately, the old fracture showed itself. In Exodus chapter 16, the people are free, but they are terrified. They look around the barren desert, and their stomachs begin to rumble. What do? They panic. They complain against Moses and Aaron. They say that they would rather be slaves in Egypt, sitting by pots of meat and eating all the food they wanted, than starve as free people in the desert. They are experiencing the anxiety of Eden. They believe God has brought them out there to die. They believe God is holding out on them. God responds by setting a table in the wilderness. He promises to rain down bread from heaven. But he does not just give them bread, he gives them a daily practice. Notice how the bread, which they call manna, is provided. God does not drop a massive, towering pile of bread in the center of the camp to last for a month. He gives them exactly what they need for one single day, and he gives them strict instructions. They are to gather only what they need for that specific day. No more, no less. If they try to hoard it, if they try to save some for tomorrow out of fear that God might forget them, the bread rots. It breeds worms and begins to stink. The only exception is the sixth day, when they gather a double portion to rest on the Sabbath. Why does God do it this way? Because the manna is not just a meal. It is a divine therapy. God is actively retraining the human hands. In the garden, human hands reached out and took what was not offered, trying to secure life on their own terms. In the wilderness, human hands are forced to open up every single morning and simply receive what is given. They cannot earn it. They cannot store it. They cannot control it. They can only receive it. For 40 years, this is how Israel learns to eat again. They learn that their life does not come from their own anxious grasping. Their life comes from the word and the provision of God. Every morning, the bread on the ground is a physical reminder of God's presence. Every time they take and eat, their eyes are open just a little bit more to the reality that God is holding them together. This was the bread of the wilderness. It was a miracle. It became the defining story of God's care for his people. But there was a problem. The manna was temporary. It fed their bodies, but it did not permanently heal the fracture in their souls. Even the generation that ate the bread from heaven eventually grew old and died in the desert. The manna was not the final answer. It was a shadow. It was a physical picture meant to prepare their minds for a deeper, spiritual reality. God had retrained them to look for bread from heaven. He had taught them that when bread is given by his hand, it brings life. But the shadow had to become substance. The temporary bread had to be replaced by something eternal. And centuries later, that is exactly what happened. To heal the deepest fracture of Eden, God was going to have to provide a different kind of bread. And that profound shift took place in an upper room in Jerusalem, on the night Jesus was betrayed, when he took an ancient symbol and changed its meaning forever. The story of the Emmaus Road actually finds its foundation here. Let us go to the upper room. Jerusalem. The night before the crucifixion, Jesus and his disciples are gathered to eat the Passover. This was not a casual dinner. It was the oldest, most sacred meal in the biblical calendar. For over 1,000 years, the people of Israel had gathered at tables just like this one to remember how God rescued them from slavery in Egypt. The meal was highly choreographed. Every element had a specific, ancient meaning. At the center of the table was unleavened bread, the bread of affliction. During the standard Passover liturgy, the host would take this bread, bless God for it, break it, and distribute it. It was a ritual of national memory. The old system was not bad, it was a shadow pointing forward. But on this night, Jesus takes the ancient shadow and brings it to its ultimate substance. Luke chapter 22 tells us exactly what happened. Jesus took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, and he gave it to them. There is the pattern again. He took, he blessed, he broke, he gave. But as he hands the broken pieces to his disciples, he adds words that had never been spoken at a Passover table before. He says, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random set of details. The fracture of humanity happened at a meal in Eden. The retraining of humanity happened with daily bread in the wilderness. And now, the true healing of humanity is being offered in an upper room. Jesus takes the symbol of rescue, the bread of the Exodus, and he applies it entirely to himself. He is declaring that the true rescue is no longer just from a political empire. The deeper rescue is from the ancient fracture of Eden. He is the ultimate provision. He is the true bread from heaven. And the breaking of the bread is no longer just a reminder of the past. It is a terrifying, prophetic picture of what is about to happen to his physical body. He will be broken so that they can be made whole. He will lay down his life so that they can finally live. The disciples take the bread from his hands. They eat it, but they do not really understand. Their minds are still shaped by the expectation of a conquering king, a political messiah who will overthrow Rome with force. They cannot reconcile the idea of a messiah who willingly allows himself to be broken like a piece of bread. And hours later, everything falls apart. Jesus is arrested in the garden. He is beaten. He is tried. And the next day, he is crucified. The trauma of Friday shatters their world. The horrors of the Roman cross bury the memories of the upper room. The profound, theological meaning of the broken bread is completely lost in the overwhelming grief of his death. When the sun sets on Friday, the disciples are not thinking about the Passover bread. They are terrified. They are hiding. They are grieving a dead prophet. They had forgotten what he told them at the table, but Jesus had planted a seed in their memory. He had given them a highly specific, four-part physical action. And 3 days later, on a dusty road leading away from the city, Jesus would use that exact action to wake them up. Let us return to the dusty road on Sunday afternoon. The disciples are walking away from the city of trauma, and the stranger is walking right beside them. We are now back in Luke chapter 24. The two men have just poured out their grief. They have just confessed that their hope is dead. They explain that the women in their group found an empty tomb, but they dismiss the report as confusion. They are practical men. Dead prophets do not come back. And how does the stranger respond? He does not immediately show them the scars on his hands. He does not perform a sudden, blinding miracle. Instead, he says, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things, and then enter his glory?" And then he begins to teach. Luke tells us that, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Imagine being on this walk. For 7 miles, you are listening to the greatest biblical teacher in history unfold the entire sacred scroll. He takes them back to the Garden of Eden, where the human fracture began. He takes them to the wilderness, where the bread fell from the sky. He takes them to the Passover in Egypt, where the blood of the lamb painted the doorposts. He walks them through the suffering of David and the agonizing prophecies of Isaiah. He takes every shadow they have ever known, and he shows them the substance. He is rebuilding their entire theology from the ground up. Later, they will look back on this walk and say, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" The teaching was perfect. The explanation of the text was flawless. The truth was piercing their souls. But here is the detail we cannot miss. Their eyes were still closed. They are walking in the presence of the risen Christ. They are hearing the perfect explanation of the biblical text. Their hearts are physically burning with the weight of the truth. Yet, they still only see a stranger. This is a profound reality in the Gospel of Luke. It is entirely possible to have an accurate theology, to understand the sweeping narrative of Scripture, to feel a deep emotional response to the truth and still not fully recognize the presence of Jesus when he is right next to you. Knowledge alone, even perfect knowledge, does not heal the ancient fracture. The sermon prepared the ground. The teaching warmed their frozen hearts. The unfolding of the biblical scroll was absolutely necessary to frame what was about to happen. But the word spoken was not the final key. The sun begins to set. The 7-mile journey is coming to an end. They approach the village of Emmaus. Jesus acts as if he is going farther down the road. He does not force his way into their home. He waits for an invitation. And because their hearts have been softened by the teaching, they urge him strongly. They say, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he goes inside to stay with them. The door closes. The dust settles. The long Bible study is finished. They sit down at an ordinary table in an ordinary house for a simple evening meal. The spoken word has done all it can do. It is time for the final revelation. And at that table, the guest reaches out his hands to the bread. The door to the house in Emmaus closes. The dust of the road settles. The sun has gone down. The long journey is over. And the 3 men take their places at the table for an ordinary evening meal. In the ancient Middle East, the rules of hospitality were clear. The master of the house was the one who presided over the table. The host took the bread, offered the blessing, and distributed it to the guests. Jesus was the guest. He was the stranger they had just invited in from the road. But as the meal begins, a subtle shift happens. The guest assumes the role of the host. He takes the center of the table. He reaches out his hands. He takes the bread. He looks up and blesses it. He breaks it, and he gives it to them. He took. He blessed. He broke. He gave. In that precise moment, the text tells us exactly what happened. Luke chapter 24, verse 31 says, "Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him." This is the theological climax of the Gospel of Luke. It is the moment the entire biblical pattern has been building toward. To understand the full weight of this sentence, we have to listen to the echo from the beginning of the scroll. Remember the Garden of Eden, Genesis chapter 3, verse 7. After Adam and Eve took the fruit and ate it, the text says, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened." It is the exact same narrative beat. The Greek translation of the Old Testament and the Gospel of Luke use identical imagery to describe what happens to human vision at a meal. But look at the staggering reversal. In the garden, human hands reached out to take what was not offered. They acted as their own hosts. They grasped for independence. And when their eyes were opened, they saw only their own ruin. They saw their nakedness. They felt shame. They ran from the presence of God, and they hid in the trees. At Emmaus, human hands do not grasp. They do not take. They wait. They sit at the table, and they simply receive what the true host gives them. And when their eyes are opened, they do not see their own shame. They see the glory of the risen Christ. The great fracture of Eden is finally healed. The curse of the first meal is broken by the grace of this meal. The shadow of the manna in the wilderness, the daily bread that kept Israel alive, has finally found its eternal substance. The bread of affliction from the Passover table has been transformed into the bread of life. Everything Jesus had just taught them on the road suddenly locks into place. The burning in their hearts matches the reality in front of their eyes. The scriptures are fulfilled. The Messiah had to suffer, be broken like bread, and enter into his glory. They see him, truly, fully, clearly. But then, the text does something deeply unsettling. Read the rest of verse 31. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. He vanishes. He is simply gone. The broken bread is still sitting on the table. The pieces are still in their hands. The room is suddenly quiet. Think about how strange this is. For 3 days, they have been weeping over his death. For 7 miles, he has been walking with them, hiding his true identity. They finally arrive at the destination. He finally reveals who he is. And the exact moment they recognize him, he leaves. Why would Jesus vanish the second they finally see him? Why not stay? Why not celebrate the resurrection right there in the room? Why withdraw his physical presence at the very climax of the revelation? The answer to that question is not a magic trick. It is the final, profound truth of the Emmaus Road, and it changes everything about where we are supposed to look for him today. The room is quiet. The guest is gone. The two disciples are left staring at an empty chair and a torn piece of bread resting on the table. Why did he vanish? If the resurrection was the ultimate victory, why not stay? Why not walk back into Jerusalem the next morning and show himself to the rulers who crucified him? Because the goal of Emmaus was not just to prove he was alive. The goal was to change how and where his followers would experience his presence from that moment forward. In Eden, humanity lost the presence of God by grasping for food. In Emmaus, humanity recovered the presence of God by receiving it. But if Jesus had stayed sitting in that chair in Emmaus, his physical presence would have remained limited. He would have been localized to one room, one village, one table at a time. By vanishing the exact moment their eyes were opened, he was making a profound theological statement. He was showing them that his presence was no longer bound to a physical body sitting across a wooden table. His presence was now bound to the pattern he had just fulfilled. He had attached his life to the taking, blessing, breaking, and giving. And once you see that, the rest of the New Testament suddenly makes sense. Just a few weeks later, the book of Acts describes the birth of the early church. Thousands of people are suddenly following the way of Jesus. And what is the defining mark of their new community? Acts chapter 2, verse 42 says, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer." Notice the specific phrasing. The text does not just say they ate meals together. They devoted themselves to the breaking of bread. The early Christians understood that the table was the place where the fracture of Eden was actively healed. They understood that every time they gathered, took the loaf, blessed it, broke it, and gave it, the risen Christ was among them. The revelation of Emmaus was continuing in every house church across the ancient world. But the pattern does not stop with the communion table. It becomes the shape of the Christian life itself. The followers of Jesus soon realized that they were meant to become the bread, taken by God, blessed by His grace, broken through service, humility, and sacrifice, and given for the life of the world. The sequence of the upper room and the road to Emmaus is the quiet architecture of redemption. It tells us that God does not heal our deep, ancient brokenness by demanding we work harder or learn more facts. He heals us by inviting us to a meal. The two disciples did not stay in Emmaus. That very hour, in the dark, they got up and ran the 7 miles back to Jerusalem. Their faces were no longer downcast. They were carrying the fire of the resurrection. If this study has helped you see Scripture with fresh eyes, subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive into the biblical text. The story of the Emmaus Road reminds us that God is often walking with us long before we recognize Him. And the meal at the end of the road was never just a conclusion. It was the healing of Eden. The breaking of the bread was never just a simple dinner. It was the moment heaven finally opened our eyes.